Edesio is a long-standing associate of the Lincoln Institute. In 2001, he actually gave a presentation on the same topic here. And it's interesting that this was just after the book has been, the Mystery of Capital has just been published. This in 2000, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be interesting to compare notes of this time with 8 years ago, right?
Yeah.
By the way, that presentation was actually published in a landline piece. The main ideas there, to whoever wants to consult there. Edesio is currently a visiting fellow here with us. He's spending the semester and preparing a book on the critical essays on Hernando de Soto. We expect this to be ready by July sometime.
Yeah.
And he's putting together a comprehensive collection of articles of people who have written about Hernando de Soto. And he's also preparing a policy focus report for us on regularization policies experience in Latin America. Edesio holds a PhD from Warwick University, and he's a Brazilian scholar, but who has been spending quite some time in the UK. But he doesn't have so far the accent that Mangabeira Unger has in Portuguese. So but Mangabeira Unger is the long-standing professor here at Harvard, also a lawyer. He is currently also a associate to DPU, the Development Planning Unit of University College in London, where he teaches when he has some time left out of his busy agenda, globetrotting the consulting. He has been around in quite a few places. He has also recently been invited as the United Nations Habitat Advisory Group on Forced Eviction. And he has written extensively on social legal dimensions on the process of urban development internationally, and particularly regarding on the social legal implications of the phenomenon of informal development. In 2003, he was director of the land affairs for the recently created Minister of the Cities in Brazil, in which position he formulated and coordinated, the first Brazilian national program to support sustainable land regularization, and where I believe his influence has been even higher than De Soto's in shaping the content of that program. So in today's presentation, he will take stock of De Soto's influence on the land tenure and other regularization programs of informal occupations. So with much ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Break a leg.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. What I thought I should present to you, instead of focusing on any specific issues, I'll be providing quite a general overview of the debate initiated by Hernando de Soto's ideas on how to tackle the phenomenon of informal development. And my main intention is to show to you how complex this discussion is. So that's why instead of focusing on specific issues, I'll be presenting you this panorama of De Soto's agenda for economic development. And I have organized my talk in 3 parts. I'll present very briefly the basic aspects of De Soto's agenda for economic development. Then I'll organize some of the main criticisms resulting initially from the theoretical analysis of De Soto's books, and more recently also from the empirical research that has been undertaken in many countries where De Soto-inspired policies have been implemented. And finally, I'll offer you, if I have time, some basic elements for a different approach. I don't think it's necessary to stress, but I'll do that anyway. You see the importance of a critical assessment of De Soto's ideas, not only because of the global relevance of this debate on informal development, not only in Latin America, but also in Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, the Middle East. The rates of informal development are very high these days, but also considering De Soto's extraordinary contribution to this debate. De Soto's ideas have been extremely popular as well as long-standing. We've been discussing De Soto's ideas for the last 20 years. His first book was published back in 1986, and ever since we've been discussing De Soto's influence. But above all, I think the main reason why we should be discussing De Soto is that unlike other thinkers such as Amartya Sen and Muhammad Yunus, De Soto's ideas have been translated into large-scale policies. They've been affecting people's lives internationally in a very strong, in a very direct way. And I'll be using the case of Peru as a reference throughout my talk because this is the main paradigm we have where De Soto implemented initially his large-scale program, and this model has been replicated elsewhere. And the underlying questions that I'll be addressing are the main appealings behind De Soto's ideas. Basically, they come across as a simple solution, as well as the numbers he's talking about, especially considering the amount of so-called dead capital, which I'll be discussing here. Are these factors reliable? Secondly, the highly costly De Soto-inspired public policies in Peru, Albania, and elsewhere, have they been fully justified? I mean, have the enormous investment of public and private resources has been fully justified? And finally, has the De Soto agenda for economic development been expressed in the right terms, or has it been a smokescreen to hide deeper issues, right? So these are the three main questions that I'll be addressing. So as you may know, De Soto wrote two bestsellers on development economics. Initially, The Other Path, 1986, translated in 1989, and then The Mystery of Capital, written in Spanish and translated into English on the same year, in 2000, and available in over 30 countries, 12 languages. So it's really quite a rare feat. It's two major bestsellers on development economics, with several dimensions being discussed. I mean, the recognition of the extent, dynamics, innovations of informal processes, both housing and business. This is quite interesting. De Soto is not only talking about informal housing, but he's also talking about informal businesses, placing emphasis on actual and potential economic value of the assets generated through informal processes, a very strong critique of the overall legal system, including the dynamics of the judicial systems in the registration systems in place in developing and transitional countries, and also a powerful critique of bureaucratic administration and corruption in developing and transitional countries. But of course, the more discussed dimension of his work has been his argument that the organization of property rights is the means, is the most significant way to promote economic development in both developing and transitional countries. So De Soto seems to propose quite a simple solution. Governments should remove all the existing legal and institutional barriers so as to guarantee the materialization, recognition, and circulation of economic assets that have been produced through informal housing and business practices in developing countries. So basically, he's saying that governments should leverage what capital assets already exist and increase the participation of mortgages in the gross national product. So this is basically the De Soto formula, which seems to be quite simple. And this simplicity is one of the most appealing factors that have made De Soto's proposal so popular globally. So in this context, titling, land titling, and registration are the means to promote security of tenure for those people living informally in consolidated urban areas. That would, according to De Soto, lead to access to official credit, make it possible for people to finance progressive investments on housing and business consolidation, revive and maximize what he calculated as $9.3 trillion of dead capital, almost $7,000 trillion being dead capital invested in informal property, as well as making it possible the integration of the urban poor into the market and thus eradicates urban poverty. So this is the De Soto promise, right, basically here. There's another less discussed dimension of his work, which I think is interesting to mention briefly. If you pay attention at the subtitles, of the first book in the English editions, right, there's quite a significant change. The original subtitle was The Other Part, The Invisible Revolution in the Third World. After 9/11, the subtitle has become The Other Part, The Economic Answer to Terrorism. Right? So De Soto is clearly there, and his publishers as well, they're clearly playing on these powerful ideological links between informality and marginality, between property ownership and democracy. And very much as a result of this powerful ideological equation, the Institute of Liberty and Democracy created by De Soto in Lima has been recently considered to be the second most influential think tank globally, right? And there's another dimension which I'll refer to very briefly regarding the disputes for the authorship of this first book. If you take the original Spanish version of The Other Part, you see that De Soto is the author together with two other people, Enrique Garzi and Mario Ghibellini. But these two guys have disappeared from all the subsequent editions of The Other Part, both in English and in Spanish. And last year, there was a judicial decision in Peru condemning De Soto for, the theft of the intellectual rights of these two other co-authors. This hasn't been a final decision yet, but it's quite an interesting debate to follow on. But anyway, following the publication of these two books, most impressive international acclaim, can be identified. Fukuyama, De Soto has single-handedly been fomenting a revolution. Margaret Thatcher, the Minister of Capital, has been producing a beneficial revolution. Milton Friedman, De Soto has demonstrated in practice that titling is effective to enable the less privileged to take advantage of their opportunities. Niall Ferguson, the empirical foundations of the book are exceptional. So this is an enormous amount of hype, right? Leading to this rare international recognition. De Soto has met every single head of state, beginning with the United Nations. Bill Clinton was perhaps the most, vibrant advocate of De Soto and his ideas globally. He was given countless awards and doctorates internationally. Growing international influence, especially in the context of developing and transitional countries. Albania, Ukraine, Libya, Afghanistan, Pakistan, wherever you go, De Soto has been there. He has been promoting these ideas on how to tackle informal development and how to integrate the poor into the market economy. But the most important aspect, as I mentioned before, has been the application of his ideas into effective national and local policies and programs. In some places they are called formalization programs, in other places titling, in other places legalization programs. Sometimes they are directly implemented by De Soto's Institute, sometimes they are inspired by De Soto's Institute, and you can see the De Soto formula being applied in places such as Peru, Albania, Vietnam, Cambodia, Egypt, the Philippines, El Salvador, and the list goes on. And the requirements for these national large-scale policies are the promotion of substantial legal changes in the legal order of these countries, the creation of a very significant institutional apparatus to promote the formalization of informal settlements, as well as a large investment in information, mapping, and the formulation of land cadastres as well. Institutional support has been there all along. The World Bank, regional banks such as the Latin American, the African, the Asian regional banks, UN Habitat, UNDP, initially the Cities Alliance, which is this initiative joining the World Bank and UN Habitat, but above all, development agencies such as USAID and the Nordic SIDA and NORAD. They have been aggressively promoting De Soto-inspired policies internationally. As a result of this growing influence and power, together with Madeleine Albright, back in 2006, De Soto was able to bypass, in fact, the whole of the UN structure in order to launch the United Nations High-Level Commission for the Legal Empowerment of the Poor. And the notion there was that we need some kind of international convention, some kind of international document emphasizing the recognition of property rights as the key factor in the promotion of economic development globally. The international media also immediately embraced De Soto's ideas. You see Bill Clinton making speeches and promoting all sorts of debates around De Soto's ideas. And if you look, for example, at the influential coverage from The Economist, the weekly magazine, 2001, want to make the poor less poor, give them titles. 2003, Hernando de Soto believes that capitalism can defeat terrorism. 2003 again, Islams are growing fast. The solution must begin with property rights. 2004, why secure property rights matter, right? And this kind of acclaim goes on. I mean, last year, Le Monde in France, another very influential publication, Hernando de Soto, the countries from the South will only develop if they promote a legal revolution. And, to top it all, a couple of weeks ago, your own Newsweek, in March 2009, dedicated 7 pages to Hernando de Soto, right? And his comparison of the American economy to that of a developing country. And basically he's saying that the fundamental cause of the recession in the US is a poorly paperized legal system, right? So this is to show to you how influential and how topical and how long-standing his ideas still are. So is all this acclaim justified? So let's look briefly at the case of Peru. For those of you at the back who can't see the cartoon, basically this is De Soto with Fujimori, and De Soto is saying, I want to make something clear once and for all. He is the formal president, and I am only an informal president, right? So in 1996, under Fujimori, an enormous legal institutional apparatus was created in Peru called COFOPRI, which is the Commission for the Formalization of Informal Property, based on also a very significant institutional innovation, which is the urban cadastre, which is not the public registry. It's a separate parallel institution, as well as several specific faculties and instruments to make it possible for the government to promote a large-scale formalization program, divided into 3 stages. First of all, to produce information on the occupied land and the identification of the obstacles for their formalization, the identification, demarcation, and registration of both plots and constructions, and finally, the identification and qualification of the entitled occupiers. So this is the methodology that has been transplanted to Albania and to the Philippines and to many other places where De Soto-inspired policies have been implemented. The intervention in Peru has been extremely remarkable. It's a national intervention covering 125 municipalities, highly centralized, in the hands of the national government. And the financing comes from a combination of national, international, but above all, from the World Bank resources, right? I mean, initially between 1998 and 2004, the World Bank gave Peru a loan of $36.12 million, and recently in 2006, another $25 million were given to Peru for the second stage of the formalization program, to such an extent that in 2001, the Center for International Private Enterprise of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce declared that the Peruvian program was the #1 U.S.-supported project over the last 17 years, right? The number of titles resulting from this massive program is extremely remarkable as well. If you look at the 10 years in which the program was implemented until the second loan from the World Bank, over 1.5 million titles have been given to residents of informal zones in Peru. This is really a very significant scale, a very significant number of titles unheard of elsewhere, right? So as a result, of these influential ideas and programs, initially the critical assessment was based on the books, was based on the ideas. More recently, also on the empirical research. So let's focus very quickly on the theoretical discussion, as well as some elements of the critique of the methodological aspects employed by De Soto. Basically, all the criticisms that I have come across, they beg the question, is the De Soto proposal simple or is it simplistic? So, you know, this is very much the kind of argument that people have been, you know, discussing. So, in theoretical terms, the general understanding is that, you know, these are old news dressed up in new prints. There's nothing new in this discussion. It's just the way that the discussion has been dressed up and conveyed that make it sound like new. But in fact, this is an old discussion. Many writers, they resent the fact that De Soto fails to acknowledge the existing research on both, you know, informal development, informal economies, as well as, you know, this specific case of Peru. He fails entirely to mention, for example, John Turner, who is a leading author on informal development in Peru back in the 1950s and 60s, right? Also, his emphasis on the formalization of informal areas promotes a rupture with a broader tradition and also an incremental approach to regularization, which is not only legalization, which then existed in Peru. So he kind of promotes a rupture with this broader understanding on how to tackle the phenomenon by placing emphasis only on the matter of legalization, titling formalization. Other authors, like a month ago in this very room, you know, Arruñada from Spain was criticizing De Soto's old-fashioned approach to universal registration, when in fact you have other models such as recording, for example, available, which may be more efficient or more adequate in certain circumstances. Many of the authors have criticized De Soto for his sweeping generalizations of the history of both the United States and of Europe. If you look at the subtitles of The Mystery of Capital, it says, why capitalism triumphed in the West and failed elsewhere. So basically, he's saying that if the US are aware, wealthy, or if Europe is a developed, region, it's because of their property rights-based policies. When in fact, many of the authors that I have been reading, they emphasize that the property rights-based policies in the West, they are not exclusive. You have a number of other policies such as rental contracts and social housing, and you have many other leasehold, you have many other legal, political, institutional arrangements other than only, this emphasis on freehold titles as being the way to recognize people's rights over land and housing and access to housing. Another line of theoretical criticism tackles this notion of dead capital, the $9 trillion. Is dead capital really dead? I mean, don't people contribute to the economy, especially considering that in most developing countries, people, the tax system is indirect. That means that you pay more for services than you pay for property. So people are paying taxes. They are contributing to the official economy. And this barrier between formal, informal, legal, illegal is not that rigid, right? Is the formal sector more effective than the informal one? Many authors say that this dualist approach is simplistic. There is no necessary evolution from the informal sector to the formal sector, a better formal sector, as proposed by De Soto. Other authors in a more politically progressive kind of outlook, they say that De Soto only talks about the formalization of the economy to protect property rights and free market transactions. And he shows no concern whatsoever, to the need for a social safety net, for the vulnerable social groups of society. He doesn't say a word about cooperatives, public regimes. So in that way, according to Amartya Sen, De Soto is proposing quite a distorted reading of Adam Smith, because even Adam Smith had this kind of social concern. So, this unqualified emphasis on property rights, on freehold, individual freehold, is totally unjustified if it's not balanced out with other more socially oriented approaches. Also, other authors, they say that De Soto doesn't really understand what causes poverty. He doesn't understand the causes of poverty and actually the impact of market-oriented reforms in provoking more poverty. Right? So in that way, informality would protect the poor against economic elites in many developing countries. So you have a line of argument there, and a powerful tradition is, speaking here in the Lincoln Institute, comes from the Georgists, right? You have also a radical assessment of De Soto's policies from a Georgist viewpoint, criticizing the fact that De Soto only sees land as capital. He fails to understand that land is much more than just capital, and thus he doesn't really understand the need for the social recapture of land rent. Basically, by relying on freehold title to provide financial collateral, he is only shifting the burden of paying for public services, onto the backs of those who labor. This is how the Georgist approach has been addressing the De Soto influence on this debate on land economics, basically. There is also a legal discussion saying that De Soto's understanding of property rights from a legal viewpoint is extremely narrow and uncritical, needs to be qualified. I mean, he doesn't fully understand that illegality has been, to a large extent, provoked by legality. It is the legal order that has been, to a large extent, one of the main factors determining illegality. So instead of just proposing that people should be integrated into the legal order, he should be discussing, in the first place, how the legal order has excluded people, and how the legal reform then could be promoted to promote social inclusion. He doesn't really pay any attention to other forms of land social relations. I mean, collective rights, customary rights, restricted property rights such as leasehold, temporary rights. You have a range of other legal political options that he doesn't understand or mention entirely. He doesn't raise basic questions. Who should receive the titles? The occupiers, the tenants, the drug dealers? I mean, there are so many questions which are confronted by, policymakers on a daily basis, and he doesn't really understand the legal implications of many of these questions. He fails entirely to distinguish between private and public land, thus fomenting a massive process of privatization of public land, right? I mean, by failing to distinguish between housing rights, which is the state obligation in many developing countries, and property rights. I mean, there is no international or national law that obliges the states to recognize property rights. The law says that the authorities have to recognize housing rights to those who need it. It's not exactly the same. I mean, you can recognize housing rights without distributing property rights, especially property rights over public land. So as a result, one line of legal criticism says that instead of promoting the poor people's capitalism, as claimed by De Soto, he would be, in fact, empowering so-called rich people's reformism, in that he has been masking historical social discrepancies between those who have and those who have not. Just quickly also to mention some elements from the methodological criticisms, right? I mean, as I said to you, one of De Soto's ideas, they have two main appeals. The first one is the simplicity, and we've just seen that, it's not that simple. And secondly, is the numbers involved. He's always talking about huge numbers, $9.3 trillion. You see the dollar sign in the eyes of the politicians whenever he mentions this gigantic number. And there is quite a serious line of criticism questioning the calculation of that capital. Loose methodology, wrong methodology, have several authors deconstructing the way De Soto came up with this number, which is so appealing. Also, many authors, they complain that De Soto is always dropping figures without any references. For example, when he talks about Mexico, which is quite a significant case study, he doesn't provide one single reference from where he got the numbers. Right? So you have to take it at face value. You have to accept what he's saying. Right? Also, the case studies that he's used, Lima, Mexico, Manila, Cairo, and Port-au-Prince, wouldn't justify universal conclusions. I mean, if he were talking about China, India, Brazil, huge countries, with a very complex situation, perhaps. And another line of criticism has emphasized that even when De Soto criticizes the way bureaucracy has been preventing people from, integrating into the market, needs to be reconsidered. There's a famous line in De Soto's book when he said that in order to open a business in Peru, you have to follow 728 steps. You have to talk to 50 organizations and all that. So he proposes the simplification, which in itself is quite a significant and sound idea. But researchers have said that this is, this is a fantasy. This is really not true. But anyway, what do we know 15 years later, right? I mean, now that we have this growing tradition of international research, and above all, now that we have empirical verification of De Soto's ideas, right? So what has happened to the expected outcomes and what have been the unanticipated consequences of formalization policies formulated, a la De Soto internationally? This is a discussion all the more important in the light of, the widespread credit crunch, foreclosures, and repossession of homes internationally, right? So basically, what do the research findings tell us? And everything I'm going to mention here has been, proved by researchers internationally. So let's put aside all the theoretical and methodological points that I have just mentioned here, right? And let's concentrate on the empirical research. So what happened to the expected outcomes? 3, access to credit, investment in housing improvement and poverty eradication. These were the De Soto's promises, right? So what happened to them? Access to credit, main findings, insignificant access, and this not only in Peru, but also internationally. Here, in the conference organized by the Lincoln Institute last year, we had 2 professionals from the World Bank presenting their comparative study involving several countries, and their main conclusion is insignificant access to credit, right? Banks have difficulties to lend to the poor, require securities valued higher than the loans, and do not trust the repossession system. So the banks don't really lend to the poor. More, in many contexts, the people living in informal settlements do not want to borrow. They prefer to rely on their informal credit mechanisms, including growing practices of microcredit, right? And in some contexts also people fear risking their properties, their sole properties, their homes basically, in exchange for very small, insignificant loans when the banks are prepared, to lend something. The amount of money is never that relevant. More, we know that waged workers without titles have had more access to official credit than titled people with no jobs, with no paychecks to give to the banks, right? Also, whenever they have access to official credit, in the vast majority of cases, it's not to use their houses as collateral, right? It's to have access to some kind of credit lines to buy building materials. But in most places, you can have access to those lines even without credit, without titles. So titles are not a fundamental requirement for people to have access to bank of materials kind of programs. And more, we know that access to credit is also linked to many other factors. Contacts, language, being able to speak to the bank manager, right? Education. So you have a number of other factors that De Soto really doesn't take into account. Look at the data from Peru, 2008, right? You see that until 2003, the number of people who had access to credit, official credit, out of the 1.5 million titles, right, was something like a 3.9. And the value, the average credit was $5,500. This number has increased between 2003 and 2006. You have something like 20% people having access to official credit, but two things have changed. First of all, the average credit has decreased significantly. It's only $2,000 now, right? And more. The vast majority of these people only had access to bank of materials kind of credits. They weren't offering their houses as collateral, right? So this is quite a significant. The other promise from by De Soto that titling would lead to investment in housing consolidation. We know now, from empirical evidence that titling helps, but it's not a requirement. Just look at any Latin American city where you have a stable situation over the years, and you see that people systematically invest towards the improvement of the housing conditions. Look at Brazil, right? And without titles. So titling may help, but it's not a condition for people to systematically invest in the consolidation of the housing. The perception of security of tenure seems to suffice. So you don't need the legal security of tenure as such. If you have a pact, a social pact, a combination of factors leading to this perception of security, that's enough for most people to start investing systematically in their houses. Poverty eradication, the third promise, right, De Soto made. We know now that there's more to poverty than the lack of titles, in the same way that there is more to informality than poverty. The rates of informal development have been higher than the rates of poverty growth. So there's more there. There's more to be considered. There's more at stake than just poverty. Formalization programs, they have no concern with wealth and income redistribution. Of course, if you have upgrading programs, infrastructure, services, and all that, of course, they do have a positive impact on people's daily living conditions. But legalization programs, per se, they don't have any structural impact on poverty, right? And people have not been fully integrated into the market as promised by De Soto. Just look at this graph from Peru. Peru, again, is interesting because Peru had the highest rate of development in the whole of Latin America last year, right? But the decrease of poverty wasn't significant. So despite this large-scale program giving titles to people, there's no clear relation between, giving titles to people and a significant decrease in social poverty. Peru, again, you see, better roads, education, and social policy are all needed. Titling is not the crucial element in that respect. I have to acknowledge that there have been some positive assessments, right? Which I personally, think are very questionable. You have people associating, titling with factors such as increasing children's nutrition rates, improved education and reduced number of days missed at school, lower teenage pregnancy rates. I think these are very questionable findings resulting from very questionable questions. Because I can't really see how these positive developments would be a clear consequence of land titling, lower pregnancy rates as a consequence of land titling. So to my mind, you see, there's a lot of ideology there. There's a lot of property fetishism in this kind of research. Because what I think is more necessary these days is less hype and a more balanced, critical reading of De Soto's ideas, because we know that unlike his main promise, there are no one-size-fits-all solutions. Much as I understand, especially from the viewpoint of policymakers and politicians, this need for simple solutions. There's no such thing as a simple solution to a very complex phenomenon of informal development. And this has been reflected in the way sectors of the media have been now reconsidering De Soto's idea. Look again at The Economist, right? 2006. Giving land titles to the poor is no silver bullet, right? Title is not enough in itself to animate the debt capital. The Economist, again in 2006, land titling is a good thing, but it does not in itself create capitalism. We need sound economic policies, educated workforce, and political arrangements. Discussing the high-level commission for the legal empowerment of the poor. Again, the Economist last year saying that following a 2-year impasse among the members of the commission, De Soto seems to have lost ground. His ideas are not so influential as they used to be. A much broader view of legal empowerment is necessary than Mr. De Soto's focus on property rights. So there's a dispute going on there, people gradually understanding that this emphasis on freehold titles as the solution to everything needs to be qualified. But what we need to focus more is not so much on the expected outcomes, which didn't materialize, and more on the unanticipated outcomes, which did materialize. So we know now that large-scale programs have had a major impact on informal land markets, on the generation of unsustainable settlements. They involve extremely prohibitive financial costs. They have led to political manipulations, and they have been undermined by problems with registration. How? We know from research that the mere announcement that a legalization policy or formalization program is going to be implemented increases prices within the informal settlements. So increasing informal land prices is one very concrete consequences of this program. Higher horizontal and vertical density, more people come to live in the areas that have been formalized. Saturation of the precarious infrastructure, equipment and services. In principle, in 5 years, all the infrastructure is totally obsolete because more people have come to live in the area. Also, several forms of distortions and abuse, the so-called tourist plots. I mean, people who don't live in the informal settlements, abusing the system in order to be given titles, which they then either rent out. I mean, the increase in rental contracts in informal settlements all over Latin America is a very significant recent phenomenon, right? New informal settlements being formed as a result of formalization policies. Look at Peru, January 2009. People invading public land, right? This is the very beginning of a new settlement, and COFOPRI saying we are not going to formalize it. But these people are invading, gambling on this kind of, chance that they are going to get their titles as a result of this large-scale program. And look at the conditions of the settlement, right? A month ago in Peru. More than that, I mean, the emphasis on legalization and this failure to understand other dimensions, especially urban environmental conditions of the informal settlements, has led to the legalization of completely unsustainable areas and the legalization of totally precarious constructions. I mean, if you go to many of the areas legalized in Peru, 10 years later, people still don't have water, sanitation, access to services, transportation. So there has been no proper social spatial integration of these areas into the broader urban structure. Environmental degradation. Look at this, these are, very powerful pictures of COFOPRI approved settlements. Totally unsustainable from an urban environmental viewpoint. So the emphasis is on titles, and no concern with services, infrastructure, facilities, and so on. This is legal, legalized, right? This is a legal construction. This is a legalized building. As Gustavo Rio Frio put it, this house has a title, right? With no other concern for the integration of the area, for the services, infrastructure, and all that. But one more powerful phenomenon that has been identified by researchers has to do with what we call eviction by the market. Because by giving titles to people, you're protecting them against legal eviction, right? I mean, you're protecting them against forced eviction, definitely, which is in itself is quite a significant achievement. But there is another form of eviction, which is eviction by the market, especially for the legalized areas in central location. This doesn't happen a lot in Peru because most of the areas in Peru that have been legalized are in the back of beyond, in very peripheral areas, totally unsustainable. They don't have a proper market value, right? I mean, they do have, of course, but they don't attract developers and promoters from the outside. But we do know from research that in more central areas, whenever titles are given in an isolated way, without being combined with other urban policies, right, there has been pressure from the market so that people sell their newly acquired titles to developers and promoters. So prices people get, they are not sufficient to guarantee access to housing in central areas in the same conditions. So what happens is very often that people invade another plot of land where the process starts over again. Traditional communities have been affected and evicted, especially in Southeast Asia. The day after the tsunami, Condoleezza Rice said, this is a tragedy, but this is also an opportunity. And basically this, in fact, has been an opportunity for the penetration of global real estate capital. If you go back to many of the coastal areas in Southeast Asia or even in Africa, you see that all the traditional fishing villages and communities have disappeared. They've been replaced with hotels and resorts and this kind of development. Also in India, we have research indicating that the World Bank and now the Bill Gates Foundation sponsored programs of land digitization have led to the formation of land mafias interested in the gentrification of those areas. If you look at Slumdog Millionaires, right? You see the place where the favela, the shantytown used to be, is now occupied by those enormous towers, and so this is very much in the heart of Mumbai or Bangalore or where else. So quickly on gentrification, in October 2007, the highly prestigious geographer David Harvey, writing about the right to the city, he said, I wager that within 15 years, the favelas of Rio, on the hillsides of Rio, will have been occupied by high-rise condominiums with fabulous views over the bay, while the favela dwellers will have been filtered off into some remote periphery. So he's waging here that in 15 years, this is going to happen in Rio as a result of the legalization programs discussed there. 2 months later, right, all the Brazilian papers had this headline: German developer has bought plots in the favela in order to build a hotel complex. Right, a highly prestigious favela, in fact, given the location and the views. So this is not your Peruvian settlement in the periphery. Right? This is a highly appealing, land in the heart of the city. So only to illustrate this point about the pressure from the market, the eviction by the market, which is happening everywhere. Finally, quickly, costs. We now know that COFOPRI-inspired programs, they are not financially self-sustainable. The Peruvian program, with all its impressive numbers, has only been possible given the enormous loan given by the World Bank. It's about $60 million so far, right? With no financial participation from the people living in the area is totally insignificant. I mean, the legalized areas have not been fully integrated into the property tax system, right? We know also that local programs, they are cheaper and more effective than these centralized programs. In Peru, we have data indicating that the plots legalized and upgraded at the local level by a local program, they cost 50% less than the national program. So this is a very significant point to discuss as well. Political patronage, the manipulation of these programs for political purposes, titles for votes. This has been happening everywhere, weakening community bonds, thus limiting people's access to public services. Clientelism has been reproduced again and again as a result of this kind of approach, including a dimension of gender distortions. Now that women are some of the main stakeholders in this process, the heads of households and some of the more active actors in buying and selling informally, when it comes to the legalization of the areas, titles tend to be given to the men, because there's this legal identification of the man as the head of the household. So women are losing again, right? Given the way titles have been given in informal settlements. Finally, De Soto promised not only titling but also registration. And this is important because in Peru and elsewhere, registration is what constitutes ownership. You're not the owner if you don't have it registered. But he has failed so far to confront the very powerful, vested and open interest of the registry people. Right? So what he did both in Peru and Albania, where I've been working for 10 years now, was the installation of a parallel system, which is not the registry system. So in the end, these 1.5 million titles that people are given, they don't have full legal validity because they haven't been fully registered. And this is De Soto's latest publication, which hasn't been translated into English yet. It's called The War of Notaries. It's going to come out in English soon, exactly on this point. That's all his attempts at promoting the legalization of the areas has found a major obstacle in the way the registration systems have not been reformed in a significant way. So basically, the main conclusion is that, by emphasizing legalization, formalization, titling in such an isolated way, we, De Soto and policymakers would be mistaken effects for causes, right? I mean, instead of understanding the causes of informality, they are aggravating further and generating more distortion in land and property markets, increasing social spatial segregation, confirming the status quo, confirming an exclusionary legal system. So regularization, formalization cannot be the public policy par excellence. It needs to be combined with other preventive land, urban, housing, and fiscal policies that democratize the conditions of access to land and house. So basically, quickly to conclude, do the problems resulting from De Soto-inspired policies, do they outweigh the advantages, their advantages? And more than that, are titles necessary? Right? Titling, formalization, legalization, is that necessary given all the unanticipated outcomes that I've just mentioned? So my main conclusion in the 1 minute that I have left is titling is important from my viewpoint, but not for the reasons given by De Soto. It's not to provide access to credit, eradicate poverty, or promote investment in the consolidation of housing. You have a range of reasons why titles are important: to promote security of tenure, protection against forced eviction, right to housing, materialize economic context of rights and assets, yes, minimize marital, family, and neighborhood legal conflicts, facilitate market investments, yes, strengthen communities, redress gender imbalance. You have many reasons why we should be discussing, yes, titling programs. The question is, what kind of titles, right? And there, we have to consider that there's a wide range of possibilities. Individual freehold is one, but you have also collective freehold. You have leasehold, individually or collectively. You have surface rights, you have rental contracts, you have temporary permits like in Kenya they've been using. You have all sorts of possibilities for dealing with different situations. You can't apply this one-size-fits-all formula to completely different legal, urban, political, social situations. So if De Soto is proposing the other path, I think that there is another path to be considered, right? One in which there is an articulated, an articulation of remedial programs such as legalization and preventive programs to, break this cycle of informal development. One in which there is an articulated approach to regularizations, not only titling, but also upgrading, but also socio-economic programs to generate income and jobs, supporting mechanisms. One in which different legal situations are given different legal solutions, including by distinguishing between housing rights and property rights, by distinguishing between distinguishing between public land and private land, which should not be treated in the same way. And finally, to promote individual security of tenure is crucial, but also we have to promote social-spatial integration. Above all, we should be thinking in terms of how to guarantee the permanence of the communities in the legalized areas, how to prevent eviction by the market, how to make sure that the beneficiaries of the public investment, highly costly public investments, are going to be the people who live in those areas and not other, promoters or developed who then promotes the gentrification of the areas and the expulsion of the traditional community. So this is basically what I prepared, and I'd be very, very pleased to discuss with you whatever comments you have on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is fascinating.
In Brazil, there's this legal political orientation that what you have to take into account is what's the state's obligation, right? What you see in national constitutions, international documents and laws is to provide adequate housing to vulnerable groups, right? This does not necessarily mean to give them property rights. And also, as I said, sometimes by giving them property rights without giving them other protection, they'll be evicted by the market. So in the Brazilian case, basically, there's this distinction. When people occupy private land, they should be entitled to, yes, full ownership, not only individually, but also collectively. So we are dealing with individual and collective freeholds. But the question there is, people have a right of their own because they have occupied the private land for some time. So the state does not have to expropriate the land in order to and pay compensation to the original landowner, right? This is done through adverse possession, prescriptive acquisition. The courts declare it. But when it comes to people living on public land, basically the solution has been that in order to recognize the housing rights as well as the permanence of the communities, right? Instead of giving people private freehold titles and instead of privatizing the public land, the best way to tackle the problem would be to give people leasehold titles. So they have leasehold titles, again, either individually or collectively, which gives the state some kind of control over the area. Right? Each of the areas is demarcated into the zoning schemes as a special zone of social interest. They have their own urban regulations, their own participatory decision-making mechanisms, and the main attempt here is to prevent people from being, expelled. And with the research we have in Brazil has indicated that the poorest of the poor sell, right? The richest of the poor sell, but the vast majority stay on the land. So this is basically the main objective, so to guarantee that people stay on the land, right? So again, the motivation that is political, right? I mean, people who have occupied someone else's land, in all Latin American countries, you have this notion of the social function of property. And one consequence of that is this notion of adverse possession. You have occupied someone else's land for 20 years, 100 years in some cases. You have rights of your own. So the task of the state, that is to declare your right, is not to pay compensation to someone and then sell the land to you or donate the land to you. But when you occupy public land, this is a different matter. You can decide whether or not, in the Peruvian case, they are privatizing 100% of the public land. And so far, they have failed to confront the informal settlements on private land. These haven't been dealt with by COFOPRI, because this involves this kind of confrontation with the original landowners. But the legal implications are different.
In the 60s, I worked with John F. C. Turner, and we did several things for the United Nations. And we were very aware of the tremendous diversity of cultural contexts. And I guess we looked at it at a different level, and perhaps the other way around. We felt that what we were seeing in these barriadas and so forth was actor self-interest. And the simplest paradigm is if I'm a person who builds a cart and a highway robber comes along or the government comes along or some bully comes along and says, I'll take that cart. I've invested my effort and someone can just take it away. So this to us is sort of a litmus. It tells us where, if I were to build that cart and I know it's going to be taken away, I might as well just sit at home, tell stories, or whatever. These energies, this is not poverty, this is a reflection of self-interest. Whether you're invading lands, whether you hook up with the banks and so forth. And so our feeling is that the most important part of this is whether there is a system of laws that is clear enough for the unsophisticated, that says if you do this and this, you'll gain title, you'll gain credit, or whatever. And what fascinates or frustrates me, the principle is very simple, but in your presentation, what's woven around it is all this cultural baggages of how we own land, how we determine who gets credit, how bankers determine who they recognize as worthy.
I fully understand, and I hear you entirely, yes. I mean, but again, as you said, you have a whole range of different situations which cannot be treated in one sweeping way, you see. I mean, of course, I think legal system should be reformed so as to accommodate all these differences and all these different needs, in fact, right? The reform of the legal system always also involves the reform of the judicial system, the way people can claim their rights before the courts, as well as the reform of the banking system, very much so. I mean, you take, for example, again, Brazil, 93% of the housing deficit in Brazil, which is estimated as 8 million units, right, is concentrated in the population between 0 and 3 minimum wages. And at the same time, the system is so perverse that we have almost 6 million vacant properties, not land, built properties, right? So we still don't know how to tackle that. I mean, the national public banks, you see, they have changed their ways so as to accommodate the needs of those families earning more than 5 minimum wages. But this bulk of the population that needs this kind of support from the government, they're totally excluded from access to credit, including from the public banks. So I agree, I accept, yeah.
How does this come about that people are occupying land illegally and without proper titles? And whether this is a universal phenomenon or whether this is restricted to some places and not to others, whether this has to do with the rule of law, as mentioned, with weak rules and weak regulations that allow people to continue to do that, whether this is really something of the past or something of the future. Do most informal settlement now take place on private property with some rights rather than on public property without any rights? Are there any public properties left anywhere to squat on, or have they been really squatted on already? My reading of this is that this is a very limited issue when it comes to the issue of housing reform. And that is, there's some squatters somewhere. Historically, there's been some squatters, especially in Latin America, maybe in Turkey, maybe in some countries, largely, in my assessment, where there's been a lot of public land to squat on. And I don't see a lot of squatters on private land, generally speaking. I don't see any squatters on cultivated land. So this, to me, is a very small part of the informal housing problem.
I agree entirely. That said, I mean, as I said, we need to think of a broad set of urban land, housing, fiscal policies to tackle, this question of how to have access to land and housing, land with services above all, right? But that said, we have to recognize that something must be done with de facto situations, existing situations. So what do we do with consolidated settlements? I mean, some of the settlements in Latin America, they are 100 years old, and they have been recognized yet. I mean, legally, or they haven't been provided with infrastructure. So what do you do with that, right? I mean, so you can say, oh, let's draw a line here. We'll treat future situations in a different way. What do I do with this accumulated past, right, which is gigantic, right? And again, you can see, well, let's remove everybody because these are unsustainable settlements. you have several problems there. First of all, don't have land for that. The cost of that would be gigantic. The ecological footprint, enormous. In social terms, people don't want to live. They have their social network, their capital network. And in many places, people have rights to stay on the land. One basic principle of any legal system is that time generates rights, in the same way that time abolishes rights. So if you have lived somewhere for 50 years, you have rights, right? So, even if from a discretionary point of view, the public authorities think people should not stay there, people have rights of their own that should be recognized by the courts, right? So accepting your position that the housing policy is far more encompassing and with many dimensions, definitely we need to do something about the existing consolidated settlement. So my attempt here is to show that by giving titles to people is not enough. And it can even be a perverse way of dealing with people's housing needs, right? So we need to adopt a broader approach to what I call regularization instead of only legalization. Right? But the numbers are there. I mean, UN Habitat is talking about 1.2 billion people internationally living in shanty towns. And again, you have shanty towns and shanty towns. You have different ways and different legal, political, urban, environmental categories there, but the numbers are enormous.
Are leaseholds viable and sellable, and can you recommend a study that shows how they dampen speculation as compared to the private property ownership solution?
Well, is there a market for
Is there a market?
Yeah.
Of course. No, I don't have an answer for you. I don't think that there's enough research on that. The experience, for instance, the experience in Brazil on leaseholds on public land, of how many of them have actually sold their or negotiated their position there, the rights there. I don't know of any research that has done this so far.
What I've seen more significant has been research in Vietnam and Cambodia, right? And apparently, yes, there's quite a lot.
In many places, there are not only in the consolidated areas, they're increasing dramatically the amount of rental houses. Yeah. Lots of building and rentals. Sometimes
the governments?
No, these are private, fully private. These are houses built in consolidated areas where people expand because now they feel secure. They build second, third. There are
sometimes
favelas.
8 floors.
Yes, there's a building in Rio of 11 floors in a favela. Just to give you an idea of how
and what is interesting is that people have this notion that informal development is unregulated, but it couldn't be more regulated through informal mechanisms. You see, I mean, if you go to these consolidated areas, you see that you have informal codes of behavior. Civil law, commercial law, urban law. I mean, who can buy, who can sell, who can build a second floor, who has right of way. These days, in many of these consolidated areas, you even have an informal notary, someone with a notepad taking notes of all the transactions and charging 8% for each registration there. So it's highly regulated, in fact. You see, the question is, it's not fully recognized, but it's highly regulated. It's like buying a property in a condo in the United States. You have a board and people, and what's happening is that, I mean, the number of vacant houses or shacks or whatever increasing, rental contracts increasing. The same process of speculation that you see outside of the informal settlements being reproduced inside. But in terms of people selling, as Martin said, numbers and data, when you talk about informal development, there's always a difficult area. But in Cambodia, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, you have a lot of more precise information.
It's an interesting issue. And there are some hints of how you explain that. But these are interesting findings on the sometimes even a more transactions being more the turnover of properties in informal markets sometimes even higher than in the formal markets. Pretty interesting.
One interesting consequence is that just to finalize, in Brazil, for example, I mean, local authorities and policymakers concerned about, this eviction by the market, right? So initially they decided to tie people down. You can't sell, you can't rent, you can't do this, you can't do that, especially people living on public land, because they had more legal control, right? This doesn't happen. This only begets more informality, more informal transactions, right? So the concern in Brazil these days is less with keeping the people on the land, the same people, right? And more keeping the land which has been upgraded and legalized at the expense of public resources for that purpose of social housing, right? So it's not exactly the same people. It's the community, the socio-economic profile of the community. So again, A, B, C may sell, may rent or whatever, but the majority of the people can be technically considered as poor, because in fact you have people from all sorts of socio-economic backgrounds there as well. You have people, I know university lecturers living in central shanty towns in Rio. You see? So,
who De Soto is and who he represents. So if he came about in the early 90s, which was sort of the origins of globalization, under the leadership of Clinton, who wasn't really known as a globalizer at the time, but he was a trilateralist. So in the amalgamation of this, it eventually came towards where we are now, in a great sort of like accumulation. But during that accumulation phase, if it's informal versus formal, the World Bank or the globalized interests can't attack a viable neighborhood from the point of view of ownership in an informal basis. So they have to, from their standpoint, like the German who comes in, he can't buy and sell to a hotel unless he's got title.
yeah, he's gambling
Per
on
se.
that. Yeah. Mhm.
It can't be informal.
Yeah.
So from the point of view of the international bankers
Yeah.
coming into an informal situation, which is right up the hillside in the favela, oh, beautiful, this is great for me, but, screw the guys living in the favela. They need this kind of institution. Is it true that there's sort of a pressure
Very
from
much so.
outside to force this?
And they need also to homogenize the legal system, to get rid of all the different legal categories. So the solution is just that one solution. So freehold, individual freehold, doesn't coexist with other legal, instruments such as collective freehold, individual leasehold, collective leasehold, temporary permits. You see, so there's quite a pressure to this homogenization of the legal regimes to facilitate the penetration of land and property capital. This goes everywhere. And so this means also to deny customary traditions. You go to South Africa, where you have, communities that came from the countryside the other day, still keep the cultural traditions and all that, collective approaches to land. You have this imposition of an individual freehold policy on communities who don't understand. They don't want that. You go to Egypt, where people in many informal settlements organize themselves around Islamic approaches to land relations, which are far more collective than in anything else. You have this imposition of individual freehold titles on communities that organize themselves socially and spatially along different lines. You see? So this has been happening everywhere. Yeah.
Who is promoting this kind of regularization programs? And you will be surprised with some of the people who are acting in the front line. And then you would sometimes it's the least expected people that you would to see there. Like for instance that congressman in Rio. What's his name?
Julio Lopez.
Julio Lopez, yeah. He has a long history of involved. No, he's involved in family-wise with property development for a long time, and he's the guy who's proposing regularization of all these favelas. They're interested in that.
And he says publicly, because once they get the titles, I'll buy them.
It's very clear. You need that.
That's first, it's a really comprehensive critique of De Soto. And,
I'm sorry it's superficial, but I thought it was important to give you the overview.
of course,
Yeah.
in this amount of time,
Yeah.
but I see a very comprehensive, and I think this is important because this book is indeed very influential. I know very well in Latin America it's very influential, and from your presentation I see that's influential everywhere. Two small points. First, part of your critics will not be really problematic if they charge for titling. So many problems that you're facing, I don't know, for instance, the tourist plot would probably disappear if you're charging people. And I think about a criticism that it was not so clear in your presentation that you could be, maybe, if you agree, you could be more emphatic, that there is also a problem of fairness, because if you have someone that have bought the land and is as poor as this guy that have not buy the land, so you are giving a gift to someone and you are not giving to another one that's as poor as this one. So it raises the problem of horizontal equity. I also think about, it's not clear to me that it was so expensive. Making a back to the envelope calculations, you talk about around 60 million given from the World Bank for 1.5 million titles. I'm talking about $40 per house. I don't think this is expensive.
You have other sources of funding as well. The main one is the World Bank. Yeah.
So I don't see it as expensive. You can charge them very easily for that, just for you to rethink. And then finally, I don't know if it was lack of time. I'm not sure if you really would support that, but you kind of say that collective titling would be an alternative. Well, regarding that, we have, and also we dispute your statement that the largest titling program is in Peru. To the best of my knowledge, the largest titling program ever is the Ejidos in Mexico. We are talking here about 15 million titles, not 1.5. And those were collective titles that were really problematic. And finally, I think your critics, although with lack of time, were very well based, except your critics to Erica and Ernesto papers, because you say, I don't believe that. And the papers you read them, they are very careful. The results are very robust. And it's also a surprise to me, the teenage pregnancy. The other results are, you can support them based on the title. But the results are quite robust for you to say, just I don't believe them. Just
of course. What I mean is, you see, that's basically to this point. It's not titling as such. It's a combination of factors: stability, security, in the sense that people felt not that has nothing to do with lower pregnancy rates. But going to school, for example, they argue that since children didn't need to stay at home anymore to defend their property against bulldozers, they could go to school. Okay, I can see that happening to some extent, but pregnancy. I mean, you have the Inter-American Development Bank last week released this research saying that the main factor in changing marital relations in Brazil has been the soap operas. You know, the kind of the way that women have been portrayed in soap operas, so women are becoming more assertive, and the number of divorces also is given the way women have been portrayed in the soap operas. So you can believe in whatever, you know. So
the people are spreading out into public land in the hopes of getting title, that suggests that they at least believe that there's some benefit to the promises.
Yes.
But the other point is, I think that the jumping to conclusions of a theory that may have some validity over the course of a century, and assuming that it's going to have immediate consequences, including maybe De Soto himself all of a sudden believing too quickly in all of the people who were supporting him, right? I mean, if you think about it, if he is saying that over the course of a long period of time, a society in which there's more land holdings, more land ownership, there's more system of laws, is a source of wealth or independence, that might be true.
Yeah.
Whether or not it can be proved over a 5-year or 10-period or 20-year period remains to be the question, right? So it still may be too early to assess the broadest theory, and as always, it may be too problematic to take a theory and begin to implement it literally and narrowly, which maybe is what you're criticizing.
No, I take a point, and in fact, I don't think I have stressed strongly enough the main advantage I see in De Soto's inspired programs. In fact, many people I work with, the main conclusion they take out of this kind of criticism is that titling is not important. Titling programs only generate problems, more problems than benefits, right?